I'm turning the Zoom floor over to Lisa Nauer, someone I have worked in Marxist education with for more than 40 years at this point, which does let you know I am as old as I look. And Lisa is going to introduce today's talk and will serve as moderator. At the end of Dan's presentation, please, for your questions and comments, write the word stack in chat if you know how to do that. If not, raise your hand in the screen or use Zoom's icon. Lisa, take it away.
Well, thank you. This is really thrilling for me. Before I went into academia, I was involved with an activist radical artists collective called Repo History that worked on a number of site-specific public art projects that were, in a sense, a kind of archaeology. Oh, and also, please mute yourself if you're not Dan. That was sort of uncovering and unearthing histories. We were looking at public spaces in New York City and the histories that were not represented, as well as really sort of taking apart some of the historical myths that were represented, looking at the built environment. So this is something that has been a kind of passion and interest of mine long before joining the ranks of tenured radicals a number of years ago. So I really just want to thank Dan for writing this excellent book. I have worked my way through, not the entirety, but enough of it. And it's highly accessible. You don't need to be an academic to take it apart, although if you are familiar with the fields of anthropology and archaeology and museum studies and historiography, I think you'll get some additional sort of layers of interest. So it really is like a palimpsest. And I think that Dan's work as an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a museum curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is one of the many, over 160, I think, repositories that we know about that have been documented, where some of these looted sacred and other materials from Benin were robbed. And I think that this is both kind of a wonderful, gripping historical tale, in a sense. I try to be very conscious about how we use language these days, about narrative. And he really unpacks, the stories behind the stories. It pulls together the accounts at the time written by the military and colonial authorities who supervised and who did the pillaging, the rape, and the looting. And sort of the theme of sexual violence really in many ways connects with the work that I've been doing in Guatemala about the historical memory of the armed conflict and really the way in which these various forms of violence and pillaging and destroying what was there of the civilizations and cultures that preceded the Europeans, and this kind of myth of the, tabula rasa, which we find, and so this resonates very much. Well, this is in some ways, a very British and a very European example. I think that is really instructive for those of us in the United States, because I think we like to kid ourselves that the Brits were the imperialists and we are the Democrats. And I think we know that's bullshit, that, our own history of, the empty continent, the wilderness, if we read the Pilgrim narratives, to, the other ways in which the dispossession and displacement of Native Americans, accompanied by the transfer of their items into the collections of historical museums in the United States. So it's very much a parallel story. I don't think we can sort of pat ourselves in the back and say, oh, there for the grace, but for the grace of Karl Marx go we. I mean, this is our story as well. So I absolutely would love to turn this over to Dan and really look forward to both his presentation and to the questions from what looks like a really diverse, in so many ways, geographical and otherwise audience. And I'm going to mute myself to make sure that I shut up for a while.
Okay, that's great. It's wonderful to be here. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully if someone could unmute just to say, yes, you can see it, that's always reassuring.
Yes, it says University of Oxford.
That's great. Okay, wonderful to be here. And, I'm doing a lot of these events at the moment, but, this is one that I'm really looking forward. I have been really looking forward to. I think, talking more about art and culture on the left is incredibly important at this moment in time, where we see in the UK and maybe with the change of administration, who knows if it will continue, but certainly we have seen in the USA as well, the attempt to invent a fake culture war, the attempt to weaponize statues, to call in the directors of museums, to criticize the National Trust for facing up to its history of its links in the past to empire, to the profits of empire. All these are live questions among some on the hard right who wish to use the culture war as the fake culture war, as a way to push back, because the first line of defense in how they're trying to push back against the success of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I wrote a piece in The Guardian actually last October that really sought to take apart how in the UK we have a culture minister who is actively involving himself in these sort of narratives. But it turns out that art is important for, politics actually, long before sort of that moment. And that those of us that work in the cultural sector in some ways have thought of ourselves as more anti-racist, more aware of the colonial sort of histories and more inclusive than maybe science, medicine, other parts of a university like I work in Oxford. But actually, I'll attempt to convince you, in the next half hour or so, that hasn't been the case. That in some cases, actually, science has been ahead of us, and that the challenge we face in fighting racism today, in the UK at least, really starts in a increasing recognition of, that racism isn't some sort of human sort of universal, that it isn't purely some moral or ethical consideration. It's a historical set of circumstances and relationships. So racism has a relationship to empire. And also museums have a relationship to empire. So, really this book is written from the perspective of, if we want to continue with the struggle to make our museums anti-racist institutions, then maybe we need to talk about these links to empire, not just of the museum, but also racism itself. And maybe our museums are crucial front lines in terms of how we address institutional racism and its relationship with, those settings in which empire has been made to last, and the justifications and the propaganda of white supremacy, of, inequalities have been made to last. Maybe we're the tip of the iceberg. Maybe we can see in museums something because of their distinctive regimes of display that are also true, let's say, in medicine, in the criminal justice system, in, other institutions which don't have the same regimes of display, which are not so performative, which are not so concerned with the visual. And it's interesting, that these museums are so much in our gaze at the moment. And, why that is, I think, is sort of coming from a range of different perspectives. I think a part of that comes from the fundamentally visual moment that lockdown has represented. As an anthropologist, I've been very aware of that, the new taboos upon being near to each other or with each other have been accompanied by a whole set of, a sort of lessening of the taboo around the covering of the face. Various on the right have been arguing early on, arguing even now, arguing against face coverings. But even the fact here we are, looking at each other, we're spending so long staring at each other on screens, even as ourselves in the corner of the screen. This visual moment, hasn't come out of nowhere, but it's also, we're seeing museums not just because we're seeing culture in a different way at the moment. We're seeing the museum, as the book argues, because the museum has failed. The colonial museum has failed. And I make the analogy of the lesson that we learn from STS, from science and technology studies, that we see something suddenly more clearly when it fails. So you try to start your car, to get to work, and it won't start. Suddenly that you see the car, right? It wasn't there a minute ago. It wasn't there on any other normal, morning that you went, on your journey, but you see it in that moment. Something similar is happening with the Colonial Museum, and maybe even more visibly in a museum like the Pitt Rivers, which sort of famously is a kind of museum of museums. Here it is, for those of you that can't visualize it. It's a department of the University of Oxford. It's one of the 4 museums that are part of the University of Oxford. It was founded in 1884. As the book explains, 1884 is a key date, both as the date of the Berlin Congress that set off what has been sort of euphemistically described as the scramble for Africa, which makes it sound like it was a sort of boys, like a sort of a Boy Scout sort of day out where the Europeans were just elbowing each other out of the way, rather than a sustained massacre of Africans, as the book argues. So 1884 was not only the date of the Berlin Congress and the founding of the Pitt Rivers Museum, it was also the date of the invention of the Maxim. And it turns out that the machine gun had an incredibly, central role in what the book actually reframes as what I call World War Zero. This 30-year period in between 1884 and 1914, which was presented at the time and has been imagined ever since as a series of random, unconnected so-called expeditions. Again, that Boy Scout thing again, but in fact involved the experimentation with the most, the same sort of ultra-violent technologies of the rocket launchers, of the barbed wire, of the searchlights, of the machine guns that would find their way to the soil of Europe in the 20th century. These were being experimented with on African bodies for 30 years. So a museum like the Pitt Rivers, I guess we're aware of those histories. We're aware of the pulling together of 600,000 objects from every part of the world, of the central role of Oxford as an institution that was involved in inventing anthropology and archaeology as they were invented in the 1880s, 1890s, and reinvented to some degree, as an institution that trained colonial administrators and soldiers who then, later in life in the 30s and 40s and so on, actually gave all the objects that they had acquired to this institution. But as a curator, obviously a big part of my job is to keep things the same, to make sure that the textiles are not eaten by moths, that the metalwork is not rusting away. But the book argues there's been a sort of a mission creep for many of us in the museum world who misunderstand our role as to stop history from happening around us, to stop time. We've mistaken the conceit of the museum, that it's an intervention in time that, through the work of the conservator, slows down things. And we've imagined that we're so in control of this thing that we can stop time. And a point at which that was really, I think, most visible was how the ideology that underlay the anthropological theory that underlay the museum sort of really came unstuck in a very distinctive way in recent years. So at the heart of the Pitt Rivers is, it's a named museum, Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, who was a soldier, an anthropological theorist, an archaeological excavator, and a collector of all of the ethnological objects that washed up in the auction houses and the dealerships of London in between the 1850s and the 1880s when he founded this museum. Here's a diagram which he drew that summed up his idea of the museum, and it's sort of the evolution of the wooden stick. At the heart is an imaginary wooden stick, and then sort of moving out from that in all directions are real objects which are in the collections of the Pitt Rivers Museum, which he's arranged in what he called hypothetical series. All of these are Aboriginal Australian objects. All of them are weapons. So you see the shields laid out on the right-hand side, the lances at the bottom, the boomerangs on the left, and the clubs at the top. His argument was that sort of human culture, exactly the same as natural history had shown for animals and plants, so the objects we make themselves are constantly evolving in very tiny ways. He turned this sort of later in life, in the 1890s, he turned this into an active argument against revolution. In fact, he said, revolutions in archaeology shows us that revolutions never happened. Nothing happens very quickly. It's a gradual process. And he told this story of the gradual improvement, which on the surface was, of course, a fairly sort of conventional, Victorian account of improvement. And at the same time was a foregrounding of the idea that we should understand sort of material culture through an analogy with sort of weapons. Actually, as the book argues, it was largely his own involvement in the so-called improvement of the rifle for the British Army, and his experiences in Crimea, when he fought the only active service he really saw was in Crimea, where the fact that the Russians had muskets and the British had rifles was an example of how a relatively insignificant alteration in technology led to a decisive change. So that's the ideology of the museum. It's laid out, each of the cases is laid out by type, showing the changes, the different forms of objects in different cultures. But it was in 2015 when the Rhodes Must Fall movement arrived in Oxford from Southampton that story that the museum had been telling for more than a century really became to be exposed in a different way. So in 2014, we as an institution felt fairly good about ourselves. We had done restitution of human remains to First Nations, to Maori communities. We'd hosted visits. We'd funded visits from 30 members of the Haida Nation. We held a potlatch on the museum lawn. We had done all sorts of outreach to so-called source communities. And suddenly this movement, which had started in South Africa in 2015, where a new generation of South African scholars at UCT who were born, absolutely crucially, they had been born because apartheid ended in 1994. They'd been born after the end of apartheid. But here in 2015, they were still experiencing racism in their university. At the heart of the academy, the heart of their campus, was a large figure of Cecil John Rhodes, who was the arch-imperialist, of course, the founder of the South Africa Company, incredibly cruel man, incredibly white supremacist, diamond miner, etc. And the pulling down of that statue was not, as some anti-racists might argue, some kind of sideshow, some distraction from the real work of anti-racism. This image had been built very purposefully in order to make the vision of white supremacy last. And it was hurting people on a daily basis, and it was pulled down. And then in October of that year, because Oxford has the Rhodes Trust, significant, enormous sort of trust fund that funds Zimbabwean and South African, as well as North American scholars who come to Oxford every year. In the autumn of that year, those scholars arrived fresh from the arguments in Cape Town about Cecil John Rhodes, and they saw in Oxford a statue of Rhodes, but also a whole host of other ways in which imperial thinking, in which colonial violence had been made to last. the Codrington Library, which is named after a Caribbean slaver at All Souls College, but most obviously the Pitt Rivers Museum. And this tweet from October 2015 was a genuine shock. It was a genuine, wake up call, aha moment, whatever you want to call it. I'd never seen the Pitt Rivers like this. I'd been a curator here for 14 years. At that point, I guess I'd been here for 8 years. I'd been involved in the Bristol, in my earlier life in Bristol, where I did my doctorate. I've been involved in the first, last time we tried to remove Edward Colston, very aware of those arguments. And we failed, of course, in a way that was succeeded last year. Very aware. I'd worked on empire and the way in which it was made to last in cities. I hadn't seen, and in this case, it wasn't the displays of weapons on the top floor that Rose Musfall were talking about. They were talking about cases like the Benin Bronzes. They were saying that when you display loot, when you display the dispossession of culture, that Africans have been asking back for a long time, that is an extension of violence. The Pitt Rivers Museum is one of the most violent spaces in Oxford. So they were referring, as I say, to the case, and we careful. I'm responsible for one of the largest collections of the objects which were stolen from Benin City, which is now in Nigeria, in Edo State, in the February of 1897. So we've got 150 of something. There are more than 10,000 objects were looted. In really a chaotic free-for-all by more than 200 soldiers and administrators in this attack, which formed, as I say, part of this more longer-term sort of World War Zero, as I framed it. But it was a key pivotal moment in the corporate militarist attacks, that the British undertook, especially under the coalition government under Salisbury of 1895 to 1900, in the final years of Queen Victoria, 1897, of course, being the Diamond Jubilee. A combination here, it's important to say, of the lethal combination in this thing that was shaped as a punitive expedition. The book goes into the logic of punishment and the way in which we know from other contexts, whether it's from Kenya or from Northern Ireland, the way in which the British have framed ultra-violence as reprisal from some supposedly earlier wrongdoing. This is a prime example, but it was not only, this wasn't a colony. This was the Niger Coast Protectorate, so informal empire. And maybe afterwards we could talk about, I've come to the opinion that indirect rule, informal empire, gentlemanly capitalism, we haven't got any good, words for these things, the protectorates and other such entities, but they have a particular relationship to looting. Because outside of the rule of law, the supposed rule of law in the colonies, these acts which are about the removal of sovereignty, the active removal of kings, but an attack upon sovereignty, the claim of sovereignty, but also the violent putting down of traditional religions. Both those things were in play. They are things we see very particularly in these liminal spaces, like the protectorates. But it was also a part of an attack that happened in northern Nigeria undertaken by the Royal Niger Company. So this is the re-emergence of the corporate model of colonialism. We might think in the 17th century, the Royal African Company, everyone's heard of the East India Company these days after Dalrymple's book, but not as many people have recognized how the corporate model is reinvented in later Victorian England. The South Africa Company we've mentioned with Cecil Rhodes, the Royal Niger Company in West Africa, led by Goldie, an incredibly powerful institution that now ultimately form the basis of Unilever in the 20th century. These incredible corporate interests, and that's corporate colonialism, corporate militarist colonialism, as the book argues, is still with us. And we don't have time to go into it today. But the book argues that this is something that re-emerges, in the 21st century, with the second invasion, with the Second Gulf War, under the Bush-Blair administration, and the ongoing relationship of sort of museums with the oil industry. But in this event, so 10,000 objects were looted. Let's just very quickly show you some of these. So we're aware, a lot of people will be aware of the 12,000 of the 1,200 or so of the famous plaques. So the bronze plaques that showed the court life of the obers, the kings who have an unbroken line that goes back earlier than Elizabeth I. This unique artwork tradition that existed for more than 500 years in the court life of the Benin Kingdom and were displayed around the palaces. You have to imagine a monumental, sacred mausoleum landscape where each ober's sort of palace was abandoned but then venerated over time. They became sacred sites, and this is what the British were attacking. Here in the British Museum on the left-hand side, we have the plaques, but here is the case in question at the Pitt Rivers Museum that shows how many more objects were taken in that attack. So those objects include a host of things, including in the center there, the ober's head, and then in the head, in a little hole in the top of the ober's head, there would go the carved ivory tusks, as we see bottom and bottom right, with again this very unique iconography, each of the tusks being able to tell a story of the events of that ober's life. These objects for contemporary Edo people, and indeed in the 19th century, not simply representing but constituting ancestors. These are sacred royal objects, but also the sculptures such as at the top left, the hornblower, the leopard, or the famous masks of the Queen Mother Idia, the hip masks in ivory, of which 6 examples are known. Here's a rare photograph of one of these altars as they were set up across the city of Benin, which are what were systematically looted and attacked in this sort of desecration. So here are 2 photographs from the Pitt Rivers collections that serve, the one on the right-hand side has often been reproduced. There's almost, what I call almost, it's been part of this sort of Monty Python phase of how ethnographic museums have tried to come to terms with the colonial past by almost, to the way in which this photograph has been reproduced, has almost been to sort of poke fun at the silly administrators in their silly hats and sort of pith helmets, doing their looting without ever really reproducing until my book. Images like this on the left-hand side that show the sheer scale of violence, the tens of thousands of people that were killed, the sheer attempt, to destroy a culture. So the taking of these objects, I want to say, was not some side effect of a military attack. It was a central technology of the dispossession of Africa in this instance. And here is, importantly, restitution, the return of these objects, and everything else that goes with restitution as well as return, has been a long-standing movement. Here, after 1897, in the years under the British, after Nigeria had been formed, the Obers and the Royal Court was reinstated. Here is Ober Okenza II receiving, via the British Museum, the first returns that were made, in this case, the 2 coral crowns and the coral robe in 1938. So the book outlines this history that I've alluded to here, and it finds, for the anthropologists, art historians, archaeologists, historians among us, it outlines how weak, how unusable the words, the concepts that I was reaching for in my discipline, in our understanding of the past, how we talk about material culture. I found all of those so lacking, and there's a degree of inventing new words that comes as part of this book. So, for example, the most hackneyed and familiar words that sort of idiom that one would use in talking about objects as an anthropologist or art historian is that rather safe idea of the object life history. This framing is how Hartwig Fischer, the head of the British Museum, finds himself able to claim that the Parthenon marbles that the taking of the Parthenon marbles were, as he put it 2 years ago, a creative act. You're recontextualizing an object. You're adding another layer onto its history. Well, in this case, that's not what happens. I want to argue very firmly that these are histories these are not additive histories. They're about taking away. So rather than a biography of objects, I have used Achille Mbembe's rereading of Foucault, where he pushes beyond the notion of the biopolitical into what he calls the necropolitical, in the context of, the forced migration of Africans and those from the Middle East, towards fortress Europe, and the deaths in the Mediterranean year on year and month on month. He says we need to talk. This is not the politics of life. So it's the politics of who lives and who dies, the necropolitical. Well, so too for the movement of objects. We need histories of loss. We need histories of death. We need to acknowledge that my job as a curator is primarily in what the book calls Euro-pessimism. It is to tell those stories, to try to undo those stories until these objects, when demanded, are returned to their rightful owners, and then the original meanings of these objects can be told and understood within the communities who are the descendant communities and the rightful owners. There's a whole set of other ideas here. I'll mention the chronopolitical, the idea, because I haven't yet, I think, quite convinced you that the museum is, fully complicit here. So let me just make that link. Within weeks of this attack, these objects were being displayed in anthropology museums. And anthropology museums at this time were, in the 1890s and early 1900s, were part of a field in anthropology that was using human remains, that was using objects to tell a story of white supremacy, to naturalize and to justify and to make endure anti-black violence. And therefore, how they did it was the destruction of the culture in Africa, the selling of these objects on the open market, their display in the museums within weeks in Berlin, London, and Oxford. They were being displayed, these royal objects were displayed alongside ancient Egypt. They were in the British Museum, they were displayed in the Assyrian saloon. The message was very clear. These are dead kingdoms. These living kingdoms have just been killed. They might as well be ancient Egypt. This is an archaeological culture. The chronopolitical then, archaeology being weaponized to say who is in the present, who is in the past, which plays into, much older ideas within merchant ethnography and indeed persisting into the present, whereby this colonialist notion that somehow the global south is in the past. The further you travel from the metropolis, you don't just travel across space, it collapses into time. So you're going back and back in time until you wind up, usually it's in Tasmania or in Tierra del Fuego, and you're in the so-called Stone Age. So museums were involved. What are we to do? Well, my colleague Nick Mazzoth, who some of you may know Nick's work, he's a professor at NYU who does incredibly important work on visuality. His work on the appearance of Black Lives Matter mean that while recognizing that fallism and restitution are long-standing African-led movements, equally the events since Ferguson and Charlottesville, since 2015 in America, exactly like the events in parallel, hand in hand with the events around Rhodes Must Fall here in Oxford from 2015. We have an ability to learn in museums from the politics of what he calls the appearance of the Black Lives Matter movement. So Nick makes the very simple but crucial observation for our purposes that the Black Lives Matter movement came in part out of a shift in visual technologies. So all of a sudden, dash cam footage and cell phone footage could actually make visible, but also make shareable anti-black violence that had been happening for centuries. He uses Hannah Arendt's idea of the space of appearance. And, you can read his book online. There's a link to it there if you're interested. What does this mean? What does this politics of seeing, the politics of say their name, what does this mean for museums that find they have monuments to anti-Black violence that are of the same date as the Confederate statues? They're of the same date as the erection of the statue to Colston, a 17th century figure, but erected in 1895 in Bristol. What we can do is we can start in what some people call the anti-colonial work of museums, what some call the decolonization of museums, what I prefer to see as anti-colonial work in museums. What we can do is we can start with the very simple task of doing our job better by telling people where the stuff is. And for the Benin Bronzes, the horror, really for me, the shock, actually, as I researched the book, of realizing that the sheer violence of that hyper-modern, ultra-violent attack of 1897 continues to shatter across the world, across more than 161 institutions around the world, each of which has a display of the Benin Bronzes. It's just absolutely shocking that every Universal Museum, the ideology of the Universal Museum, of course, it turns out that every Universal Museum happens to be in the Northern Hemisphere. Each of them has to have a Benin Bronze, retelling the story of the sacking of the Benin Kingdom again and again. And so to finish, there are some in the museum sector that will tell you that our job is to tell these histories, if you like, sort of better. We just need to be really honest. We need to fess up. We need to, we just need to be, tell warts and all the story of the Benin Bronzes. If we were to give these objects back, we wouldn't be able to do that. What that completely misses is that that's why these objects were acquired in the first place, to naturalize and to commemorate, the dispossession of Africa, the attempt to destroy sovereignty, the attempt to remove traditional religion. Our role instead is to share knowledge, but also to listen to amplify, and to act upon those incidents where African objects are being asked for return, as in the case of Nigeria has been happening for 100 years. So a part of the future for our museums is as sites of conscience, sites of memory, sites that are these are war zones, right? We display human remains in these spaces. They're full of the black and the brown bodies that were victims of empire, so they literally are, sites of conflict. So we have to hope for some sort of a truth and reconciliation process or role for these institutions. We also, though, need to recommit to the idea that we've never needed something like a World Culture Museum more in the present day than we do now. We need spaces to celebrate art outside of a Eurocentric lens. We need anthropology as a discipline to have a public space. But those public spaces should not be filled with stolen artworks that Africans want to see returned. And as we've seen with lockdown, the book explains how, last time there was a crisis for destination tourism, halfway between 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq, this ideology of the Universal Museum was invented under Blair Bush. Here today, we find ourselves at another crisis for the destination tourism industry, for the oil industry. And it's important that we, at this moment, see, lockdown for the cultural sector, not just as some dress rehearsal for environmental catastrophe, but as the beginning. This is a disease that spread around the world because of how much we're traveling, and our international travel is just not going to be like this in 30 years' time. It's almost certainly not going to be like this. Actually, maybe from now on, maybe we're at this change. Therefore, the hyper concentration of culture in New York or London, the idea that you just say to Africans, well, just if you want to see your culture, you just get on an aeroplane and go to New York or London. That was already unsustainable with the changing visa regimes that Africans have experienced. It's even more so in this environmental moment. The book compares the violence of dispossession with the notion of Rob Nixon's notion as an environmentalist of slow violence, the idea that environmental damage, the destruction of environments, happens at a certain pace. Well, it turns out it's the same for arts and culture. So I'm gonna finish there with that, as I say, hopefully having convinced you that art actually it turns out is important for world history. It is important for anti-racism, and that we can refresh our anthropology world culture museums as fit for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really just a tremendous, yes, we can all, or we can do our Occupy forms of applauding. So much here, and I really want to put in a plug for people to get the book and read it. And we've been talking a little bit with people. There are several people who also at the Marxist Education Project, people who are part of the working group, who work in the museum and cultural worlds in various areas, various occupations related as artists, as curators, as museum staff, professionals, critics. So we are very interested in perhaps having a follow-up reading group that could start with Dan's book, but there are also many other really excellent works. We can just go through the bibliography here, but it really kind of problematized, the issues of museums, of tourism. We have the World Trade Center site in New York City, the African burial ground. There are so many necropoli here that we could really, the Native American burial grounds as well, which are sort of all over the city and not terribly marked. So I see two questions in the stack, so I'm just going to repeat. If you want to say your question yourself, just write the word stack. If you write your question out, I'm going to assume that you have some audio issues and that you would like me to read the question. So if you want to say the question yourself, all you need to do is write the word stack. So I'm going to read the two questions, and they're actually related. So I'm going to take these two questions, and then we can take another two. So the first one from Deirdre is about whether the Pitt Rivers Museum has been asked to return its artifacts. And the second question really is kind of a follow-up from Kala, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. What is the process of requesting that an article be repatriated? And how long does the process take? So really, if you can kind of detail for us the steps from the request until it is possibly returned. So those seem to be a twofer.
They're quite important questions, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So restitution already is, business as usual for museums in relation to Holocaust spoliation and in relation to human remains. In America, you've got NAGPRA. 1998, the Washington Principles were established for Holocaust loot, which absolutely crucially shifted the burden of responsibility for knowing what had been taken with violence or under duress from the claimant to the holding institution. So what happened at that point was a whole set. Most art museums now have a provenance researcher who is working on that work. It's much more, we haven't seen the same activity for the return of cultural remains. So this is very much a new and a shifting part, of museum practice. To extend, it's the third leg of the restitution stool, I guess, would be African and other sort of parts of the world that were subject to colonialism to see sort of returns in those instances. The question of have we been asked is there are many museums, the most powerful and the richest institutions in this space are operating with that question in a very actively, disingenuous way. how many times does someone have to be asked? Is it that Nigeria has to ask every single one of the 161, nations? Is it that the Oba of Benin or the government of Nigeria or the Nigerian diplomat to Berlin, who recently repeated the requests? Each time we're told that this is not quite the right person to ask in exactly the right way. So really, I think the way that things are going is, if I don't know, is it offensive to try to borrow the term invented by the Bush Blair administration of the coalition of the willing, to repurpose that idea to say, well, actually, there are institutions, there are museum leaders, there are trustee boards who wish to say yes to the long-standing demands in these instances. And I think, that's incredibly exciting. And so support it, the question of how that operates, I think seeing those processes move into Nigerian sort of hands is the next moment. There's been recently there's very important work of the Benin dialogue group, and but also absolutely crucially the foundation of the Legacy Restoration Trust, which sort of brings together in the case of the Benin Bronzes, the key sort of Nigerian players. But this is a question, we're used to this from all these other contexts. The work of restitution does not happen fast. We have all sorts of models we can work from, which involves long-term relationship building with the claimant. Oxford University has recently published its new guidelines for handling claims for the restitution of cultural objects. Obviously, exactly like other institutions, we have had such procedures in the case of human remains, in the past. But there's also a great deal of important work we need to do. How can one make a claim if it isn't known actually what is held? So, it's a shock, I think, to many people to realize how many of these objects that we're talking about that were taken under colonialism from Africa are simply in the storerooms. Many, are in sort of boxes in which we do not, these are not on the databases. There's been a sustained underinvestment in the basic processes of the collections management of African objects. Here in the UK, many in our non-national institutions that have orphaned collections. They don't even have a world culture curator, never mind an Africanist. So there's so much, neglect of these collections, which we're supposedly, looking after, that iconic examples like the Benin Bronzes are incredibly, important for Nigeria and for the world. But there are, what was important about the Savoir report when it came out only 2 years ago was that it started asking questions about other kinds of, taking. It started saying, well, under what, if objects were taken under colonialism, were they taken under duress? Ideas of consent were introduced, which upset many, certainly many of my French colleagues were shocked. That was what shocked them about the Savoir report, was to introduce the language of consent. But it does mean that a live conversation in our sector, relates to, well, what do we do with archaeological objects? How do we think about ethnographic collecting? What about natural history collecting? There's the famous example of the dinosaur in Berlin that is for many an icon, an index of the sheer horror of the mining industry in sort of German East Africa, as well as being about evolution of millions of years ago. What do we do even with objects which were given? I mean, the French part of this conversation, the notion that the French museum collections are inalienable, with no reference to the idea that objects were inalienable for the cultures from which they were taken in many cases. Even that sense of objects that were commissioned or purchased. Are you able to buy something, that could never be given? So this, I think, for North American institutions, is incredibly important, because there is an argument, from the Met, for example, that, these objects were bought fair and square. The Benin Bronzes were bought at auction. It was all perfectly above board and legal. But I think increasingly people are asking the question, well, how many times does something have to change hand in between Europeans and Americans for it to become no longer stolen? And I'm not sure that there's a very convincing answer to that, other than it remains stolen goods. But these are live conversations. So yeah, how does restitution happen? We can learn. We already learn. We already know in many ways from the context of human remains. A final point is that the distinction that we curators make, often in between cultural remains and human remains, for many of the cultures and societies which are represented in our collections, such a distinction is entirely arbitrary. It bears no relationship at all to that sense of ongoing ancestral presence. So I think it is increasingly hard for us to justify the fact that while restitution has to be on a case-by-case basis, it has to be led by dialogue, it has to be led by, ensuring that this is the right process. Simply to do its own, only for human remains and never for cultural remains is increasing, except for Holocaust remains, is just increasingly a position that makes no sense. So that's, I think, where we are with the European conversation. And we're seeing so many exciting sort of developments now from the Dutch, announcements, in terms of their collections, all sorts of activity go, the French, obviously, after the Macron report, we've seen the commitment now and the unanimous sort of vote in the Assembly. So we're seeing returns to Senegal, to the Republic of Benin, to Madagascar. So this is, none of it happens fast. Rome wasn't unbuilt in a day. The book talks about a decade of returns. But I think it's overdue for the museums which we care about and which we want to feel fit for the 21st century, that we're open to these conversations now.
Thank you. I just wanted to, pipe in with just a couple of thoughts. One is, sort of when AGRA was passed in 1991, one of the issues of human remains was determining who was an actual direct descendant. And so how could you trace, and this idea of individual personhood versus collective personhood, that the ancestor has to belong to a named individual who can trace a genealogy, as opposed to a conception of personhood, which in so-called non-Western, a very problematic term in and of itself, cultures, this idea of individual personhood and individual belonging versus some collective or communal belonging. So that I think has also been one of the challenges. And I think also something that you raise in the book, and like I said, I'm going to ask the two questions that are in the stack, which is, the responsibility, the way that we're sort of framing the questions puts the onus on the people from whom things were robbed to ask for restitution, rather than saying, well, actually, no, the responsibility is on the museums to take the initiative and say, well, we have all this loot and we need to be the ones who initiate the process and not just simply, well, when the requests come in, we're going to respond to them.
Well, that's right. But I think it's important to underline, there are some in this conversation that would say, this is an attack upon museums. They want to empty museums. They want to shut, over social media, I get people saying, just burn the pit rivers down. You don't care about it. This is not about sending back. It's about giving back, and giving back when asked, but supporting the claim to be made, not making a whole load of hoops to jump through, which is impossible. And there's an etiquette to not insisting that people ask sort of too often, if you like, that to say you've got to keep asking, and somehow what you're asking is sort of never good enough. There's a further quick point here, which is, why is it, and this is a question I think for Americans, that's incredibly important. Why is it, but it's also important for us, why is it that we have seen advances in restitution that map onto settler colonialism in North America, in the Pacific? We've seen advances there, but for the very different conditions of extractive and sort of militarist colonialism, which is largely what Africa, especially West Africa in this case, actually faced. Why is it that we haven't advanced restitution in those cases? And the book mentions a little bit about sort of Patrick Wright's theories of different racializations that happen under different forms of empire. The notion that settler colonialism leads to certain forms of racialization that relate to land, ideas of indigeneity, of Indianness, that extractive and militarist colonialisms, especially in relation to the Atlantic slave trade, have a relationship of writing sort of racialization not onto land or place, but onto the skin, in the idea of sort of blackness. He talks about that in his book, The Traces of History. He talks about trying to speak about race to an American group in Australia who are trying to make sense of the blackness of Aboriginal people. Why do you call them black? Why do they call themselves black? How does this work? Because there is a distinction that's built into the racializations of empire, in between forms of racialization that relate to place and forms that relate to the skin and the body. Weirdly, and I don't quite know what this means or how we deal with it, we've seen restitution and NAGPRA and so on that's addressed only one forms of those kinds of racialization, almost like there is a community. There's a community created to which something has been settled, that can be returned rather than something destroyed. In the case of the Benin Kingdom, of course, luckily the kingdom has been recreated and so on. But there's something there anyway. We've certainly neglected Africa. I think African American colleagues are increasingly aware of that shortcoming.
Great. And I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to take up space here. So there are two other questions in the stack, and I'm going to keep on encouraging people to ask those. So one is asking for an explanation of a statement that you made. How can you make a claim if you don't know what was held? You could kind of unpack that a little bit. And the other question is about, again, unpacking the idea of necrography and how does this actually play out in practice in both your research and in the book?
Sure. Okay. So on the necrographic, we've thought of ourselves as sort of primarily as curators. Our job has been to tell the stories of African societies before an object was taken and to compare them with another society with which they're juxtaposed, so that the galleries operate as a kind of space, as a kind of Benjaminian arcade space where the flaneur floats from one culture to another. You're constantly reminded you're on the right side of the glass, right? So all these cultures are being objectified, literally objectified. And I guess I've come to realize that what I would have said 10 years ago about the role of the ethnographic museum to create the kind of racist lie of the primitive or the barbarian, as a production of alterity, I'd kind of missed the fact that it simultaneously was sort of generative of the racialization of the visitor of the 1880s or 90s, of the curator as white. These are also institutions that sort of produce whiteness. And in saying that, I've completely lost what the question was. Sorry, but the second question was on specifically.
Yeah, the second question was about, necrography and how that.
So the necrographic.
Yeah, necrographic, yes.
So the necrographic means that we have thought that we can look past all that role of the creation of difference, of our own placemaking in terms of what is Oxford. It's a place which houses all these objects from around the world. It's a centre of empire. We can look past that in order to tell, what was 14th century, Benin about? What was the world view represented by by this object and how does it compare to that? And that whole project of comparative evolutionary anthropology has been dead for 100 years. Except what happened was anthropology here in Oxford, they literally left the museum behind. They moved up the road into suburban North Oxford and were essentially, under Evans Pritchard and Radcliffe Brown and so on, they redefined themselves as kind of social anthropology and had no interest in objects. So these objects have just kind of rotted away here. Our job, my job I think my primary job as a white curator, while, being incredibly careful to do something different to the reflexive turn of the 90s, that ultimately was about sort of people like the kind of writing culture moment, the Clifford and Marcus sort of moment, if you read that literature, to kind of be self-aware of our relationship to empire. And the notion of being reflexive was at the heart of that. Ultimately, that there's a new generation out there that is saying, well, that critique just recentered the white curator, just recentered the white academic, right? It's the same old job. Yeah, same old thing. Suddenly we're looking at George Marcus again, rather than, and so I need to be careful that that's not what I'm doing. And the difference, I think, is the physical dismantling. The difference is, so I'm going to tell the history of the white guys that took these things. We're going to take them off display. We're going to give them back. And then those important histories of what these objects mean can be told by descendant communities. So the necrography is the necessary work of addressing that secondary historicity of these objects, this overwhelming layer, this dark kind of sort of crushing layer of loss and horror that is the only thing that we can see. It's this kind of cancerous thing that's eating away, that was put here when our museums were co-opted for the purposes of, death, for the purposes of loss, for the purposes of anti-Black violence. We need to excavate, the book says, take a pickaxe to it. It's literally archaeology, and remove it. And then, of course, objects can have their next, maybe it's the opposite of a biographical because it's digging down. It's doing the archaeology. When you write a biography, you think yourself back into the past, and of course, life moves forward. Well, maybe the necrography is more like archaeology. You begin with the most recent layer and work from the known into the you dig into it. So that's like it. And I'm sorry, I now can't remember the first question.
Right. Well, I was just going to remind you. So someone asked if you could explain a little bit a statement that you made earlier that says, how can you make a claim if you don't know what was held? Right. How do you get to the issue of what is known? And I think something that you mentioned in the book, which you didn't obviously have a chance to talk about everything in this very brief talk, is that we don't know anything about the objects that are in private hands. What you have documented to some degree, you don't know as much about, are the 160 plus institutions, but there are additionally objects that are not documented necessarily because they're not in public collections.
Well, that's right. And even that list, I mean, the Benin Bronzes are amongst, because of their monetary value, are amongst the best sort of documented, African objects that were taken under colonialism. Although the book does talk about the one that was found in the broom cupboard of the Scottish Museum, and there were still, I mean, there were a further 5 museums that since the book came out only 3 months ago, we've identified them in since. But yeah, that they are misleading in some ways, in that even we think we know the 161 or so institutions where these things are. Until my book came out, there wasn't such a list; it didn't exist. And for all the other potential claimants, which include nation and let's remember the nation state is part of the problem. So this isn't only about formerly colonized nations claiming from the formerly colonized nations, the idea that everything's in the British Museum, which is a lot of people think all of the Benin Bronzes are in the British Museum, but only 8% of them are in the British Museum. This is also about non-state actors in Africa, and also non-state actors like the Pitt Rivers Museum in sort of Europe. In the US, you could think about all sorts of other entities here, including importantly, as you say, the private collectors. So when the claimants could be, the kingdom of Bunyoro in Uganda, who have a current claim against the Pitt Rivers for a royal stool. We don't know anything about what happened to the objects that were taken in the Bunyoro expedition of 1892. You know, what about the Asante attacks, the 4 different attacks on Asante Ashanti in Ghana? There's no sort of list of where these things are, because less than 1% of the objects that were taken under colonialism, which are in UK museums, are on display. Almost certainly 0.01%. And even for the Benin Bronzes at the British Museum, 900 objects, 800 of them are in the stores. And we don't even know that 900 number is exactly correct. There isn't a definitive number because the work just hasn't been done. So that's what I mean. Of course, you know, let's support these claims. Let's allow this healing work to begin, but let's do so by the sharing of knowledge, which in some cases means actually just the basic sort of cataloguing hasn't been done. There's a big argument in Germany about making the accession catalogues available. But we don't, I mean, why are museum archives not in the public archives? Why is this work? And also the archives themselves are not the same, because sometimes the object itself is the archive. Here at Pitt Rivers, we understand very well it's what's written on the object. It's all sorts of the way you trace a necrography is it's a complex process of, researching what we used to call provenance. But that work is on us, I think. It's on us, and then to share it to African colleagues to do with what they want. We currently hold these objects, so we have to, and no one can make a claim if they don't know you've got something. That's the point. Hiding these things away. Look at what's happening at the Peabody at Harvard at the moment. They've just happened to have mentioned that they've got the human remains of over 22,000 individuals. And the press has been that, well, six of them, which sounds like an underestimate to me, may be enslaved African Americans. How is anthropology only just now at the point where it's having a conversation about the skulls and the human remains that it thought it could just ignore in the stores? It's the same here at the Pitt Rivers. So these institutions, we can't just ignore them. It's not enough simply to leave them alone. We have to make them visible in the way I was saying, has happened more widely with the Black Lives Matter movement, because they are monuments to them. They celebrate them, they remember, they make endure anti-Black violence.
So there's one additional question here, which asks about, to what extent are your kind of concerns and commitments and those that Pitt Rivers is engaged in shared by colleagues in other museums, particularly in the UK, and more specifically the British Museum, Sainsbury Centre, and so forth? Are these, are they also engaged in this process to the same extent that you are? And then there's a second question, which isn't exactly related to the first one, which has to do with to what extent these processes that you've been speaking about are constrained in any way by the wills of the collectors or thieves or whatever we might want to call them, people who bequeathed these to the museums, in the case that these weren't originally collected by the museum but were, given as part of a bequest. So what extent do those bequests, right?
Sure. Okay. So one of the greatest lies that's told around these questions in museums is that the will, the supposed intention of the giver should in any way be respected. There's no precedent for that at all in art museums. When things are on loan, it's a different question. But if they're given, if they're donations to the museum, of course, it can display, undisplay, it can make whatever choices it makes. There are some legal constraints to some of the national museums, but those legal constraints, of course, were overcome in the case of the UK by an Act of Parliament in the case of Holocaust spoliation. So these things, the problem can be solved. And in the case of organisations like the Sainsbury Centre or the Pitt Rivers, which are university collections, this is simply a decision of the trustees. There's the question of accreditation by Arts Council England, and Arts Council England are writing a new document that we're expecting any week. which is about cultural restitution. We don't know what will be in it, but we're hopeful at least that it's not going to set us back by 25 years. So there is some sort of clarity there. But ultimately, in all these American institutions as well, look at the list in the back of the book, the Detroit Art Gallery, has some Benin Bronzes, UCL, there are, I think, 4 or 5 of the Ivy League institutions, museums, Penn, Harvard, Brown, I don't know, it's all in the book, but these are, in those cases, it is the governing bodies of those institutions that would make the decision. I think there's a generational shift going on among curators and also museum leaders, which means we're going to see returns happening. And I think some of those museum leaders are very interested in a model of restitution, which is to sign over ownership. So there isn't a fetishization of the physical return right now, send it all back, FedEx it, wherever, just get rid of it. More sort of, well, okay, here's the rightful owner, we'll sign a piece of paper. It can be reclaimed as and when these people want it back. It can remain here for now. That's a very interesting model, I think. In the case of the Benin Bronzes, they're building a museum with the architect Sir David Adjaye involved, but I don't see that as a hold-up. So yeah, I think there's I said earlier, the coalition of the willing. I guess I'm hoping that we will be able to reclaim that phrase and that we'll see some movement. I don't know if I got both parts of that question.
Well, I assume that Calla will ask again if she doesn't feel that you that you answered both parts of the question. There's another question now in the stack about the tension between reactionary forces that are trying to uphold white supremacy and keep it in place versus the repatriation efforts.
Yeah. So at the heart of that is recognizing how white supremacy co-opted art and culture in a very specific time frame in between, say, 1884 and, say, 1935. If you look at the Confederate statues, they come out of a very specific time period. Look at the statues under debate here in the UK. And not these people that will say, the conversations about statues are just people that don't like statues. No, they just don't like racist statues, and racist statues were put up under a certain time frame for white supremacy in a very specific way. So recognizing that these already were white supremacist images, and that this goes for displays indoors in museums as well as outdoors in the streets. In New York, of course, you've got the great example of the Natural History Museum, where you've got the statue outside and the Benin Bronzes inside, right? I need to get it right. Is it Roosevelt? Whoever it is, you've got is it Roosevelt? Yeah. So you've got the two, and here in the Museum of London, Docklands, there was the physical removal of the slave trader from outside, Milligan, and within 30 yards indoors, you've got the Benin Bronzes, where a Nigerian man, a little over a year ago, made a personal protest against those, for which he was charged, actually. So the official removal of the statues outdoors versus the sort of criminalization of process indoors, we're seeing our sort of grassroots communities and movements making the connections, but we're not yet seeing the public discourse go forward. The images last summer of, white supremacists actively defending Churchill against a supposed attack is actively designed. Like I say, these are pushbacks against the advances of anti-racism. The idea that a physical statue is a threat, when these statues are there to commemorate and to make endure anti-Black violence, the bodies, the physical living human bodies who remain at threat through the criminal justice system, through racist attacks, through inequality, through poverty, the human living, breathing bodies that suffer because of ongoing racism in our society. That's how we have to push back against any idea that it's the statues, the marble or the bronze that matter. We're getting there. I mean, we have a culture secretary in the UK who's aligning himself with these far right ideas that you can just sort of bang the drum for empire, for jingoism under Brexit, that you can create a fake sort of culture war. Our job is to resist any framing of this as a culture war. This is simply about addressing institutional racism in a physical form in art and culture. And if we get it right here, my hope is that we can learn lessons for, let's say, where are the contemporary African artists in our art galleries? How much of the chronopolitical I was describing is also seen in the fact that to see African art in a permanent display in a London gallery, really, what do you go and see? Ancient Egypt, the Benin Bronzes. I'm sure there are a handful of African artists in permanent displays, but we have a trustee of the British Museum who still is there, who used his Reith lectures in 2014 to make the point that Aboriginal artists cannot, be contemporary artists. Because they're not in the present. They're doing something different. These ideas are deeply embedded in our arts and culture scene and, in our institutions. And I think if we can't get it right, the scientists, after we beat the fascists in 1945, one of the first actions that happened in this museum, where we've got the Natural History Museum at the front and the Pitt Rivers at the back, the racist displays of skulls that told the lie that there are different species of people were removed because it was bad science. We left on display here in the Pitt Rivers the same displays that told exactly the same narrative, but with culture, that there was a cultural superiority, that there's something called Western civilization that's different, fundamentally, ontologically different, from other sorts of forms of culture. So that's our job, is to, let's see the commissioning of African art for our permanent displays. Let's see the replacement. Let's see the removal of statues that are offensive and the erection. Let's allow ourselves to fight the idea, the ridiculous idea that the built environment can never change. The listed building consent is somehow a contentious question. That here in Oxford, there's Oriel College having made a democratic decision to remove a statue and coming to the end now of a public consultation. Let's hope that, I think we know that the public wants it to be removed. If the minister seeks to block that, what's the message? That you can never change a building that you own, that certain things are off limits. It's ludicrous. And I think we will win, just because it's such a silly idea that a museum could never change a display, that a building could never be altered. I mean, you'd never have the high-speed 2 railway. You'd never have you'd never have a new office block built. I mean, it's so against what you'd think the Tory party are interested in. The idea, I mean, it's so weirdly against sort of commercial interests. They don't understand where here in the heritage world, the archaeology world, we're part of the construction industry. We work with them all the time. They're thinking about this like 60 years ago. These people don't know. They're mistaking history for heritage. They want to read books that are written as if you're erecting a statue. They don't want it, but let's write books that are written as if we're pulling down a statue. Let's write books where things can change. And the book, this book is an attempt, to write a book that maybe can change, this museum.
Michael, you have a question. Do you want to ask it yourself?
Okay, I don't know how to frame this, Dan, but partway through your PowerPoint presentation, what swam into my brain was an essay I read a long time ago from John Berger on why zoos disappoint. And I was thinking very much of this, and I find that the seizure of all the animal and reptile, the mammal and reptilian and fish species, primarily from really very much from all around Africa, more than any other part of the planet, is somewhat, in fact, probably closely related. Now, our extractivism and other dominant forms have perhaps made the terrain for restitution not there for those animals to go back. Yet, one of the points Berger makes is every time we go to a zoo, and when you're a little kid, you don't know, it's like a moving stuffed animal. But as we go on, these animals don't want to be in the Bronx Zoo. The bats in the bat room, nor the snakes in the reptilian room. And I didn't know if there was a co-related movement of this kind that is very much from the same ideological and colonially dominant form that our societies and the zoological gardens represent. And one of the reasons I thought much of this is that when we were doing some research before, I did not know until this the degree to which at one point in some European cities and American cities, there were human beings, African families, actually on exhibit in museums. And I didn't know if you could speak to that a little bit. And that's not
Sure.
really a question, it's just meandering a bit on a related aspect.
No, it's incredibly important. I think understanding these exhibitionary complexes, which include the zoo, they include performance of various kinds. The human zoo, as you mentioned, the most famous example at Tervuren, just outside the Brussels sort of town centre, which is now the African Museum, which has gone through the most incredibly depressingly, incomplete attempt at updating itself. It reopened to just shock, I think, from all of us, to see how little and indeed how much worse they've made the African Museum in some ways. This was King Leopold's sort of personal museum for his sort of personal royal colony in the Congo, and as you say, he brought over hundreds of Africans to live in different types of representing different African types of subsistence, living in grass huts around in the gardens of the museum. I mean, absolutely. And this is like it's precisely the same time as the Benin expedition. It's exactly the late 1890s, early 1900s. What do we do with? I mean, I used to work in Bristol, which has a very fine or not so fine, depending on your perspective on zoos, zoo, and the zoological gardens at Bristol opened in 1842. I became very interested when I was working on things related to the Caribbean back then. How much of the public subscription for the zoological gardens came from those who had benefited from the payouts made after emancipation in 1838. So what do you do with the bumper sum of money that you've just got from being compensated, in inverted commas, for having to not own your slaves anymore? This was, the 20 million pounds, absolutely unimaginable sum for 1838 that was paid out to estate owners and slave owners. Well, a part of what they did was, they invested in a zoological garden. So there is, and I think these new forms of exhibition and of the visual have something to do with the crisis for, I don't know if we can even quite call it whiteness, the crisis for supremacy, the crisis of supremacy that comes with abolition and emancipation, which this book is partly about, but which I think zoos and other such regimes of sort of visuality are also about. There's a sort of groping around that comes with thinking, well, if we can't own other human beings, if it's proved, if we go the Darwinian route of a single origin for human species, how are we going to dominate Africa? How are we going to justify, and indeed at a time at which, let's remember, empire's getting, actually more and more violent, arguably. Certainly the scale is changing. Not to in any way to downplay the horror, the unthinkable horror of the Atlantic slave trade, but it didn't end. The violence of empire did not end in 1838 or in 1848 for the French, or with the end of slavery as we know for America. And anti-black violence does not end there. And in many ways, for Africa, it gets significantly, it changes in character. And the number of deaths, the machine gun and so on, alter. So how is it, the zoo, alongside maybe the Ethnological Museum, these institutions are built to start to tell stories about the exotic, which I think, as I was saying about the Ethnological Museum, maybe the zoo is doing something. And I have a very smart doctoral student at the moment, Rebecca Hodgkinson, working on National Trust gardens in the early 20th century. She's making a similar point. These were in part about the racialization of the visitor. So maybe the zoo, in part, the figure of the flaneur, that I mentioned earlier, indoors in the galleries, maybe that has some beginning, in the zoological garden, where you can experience, empire. You can experience, you can see your natural, via nature, you can see your own naturalized sort of position as the human against the non-human animal, which presumably is underlying that is a whole set of assumptions about Africans and other people from empire. That is maybe a beginning, but no one's yet. Finally, the British are waking up to the fact that whiteness is something that people need to study. It's like, in the North American anthropology, certainly this has been an important theme for more than 20 years. Maybe we'll see further work like that. But yeah, I think maybe the zoo is let's remember to look on the other side of the cage. Let's also, and I'm aware actually there's a very good book by my former colleague that used to teach at Ruskin College, the Oxford's left-wing trades union college. Incredibly important institution, for the UK trades union movement. She used to teach history there, and Hilda Keane is her name. She wrote a great book called something like The Great Cat Massacre, which was all about, it was writing the history of the Second World War through the fact that it turns out that a whole load of people murdered their cats in the first weeks. And I think there is a whole field of kind of animal focused histories, animal centric histories that is, that would be in that genre. We probably do need something, like that for empire.
Well, I'm glad my cats are paying no attention to this Zoom, because they would be horrified to know that. And I will make sure that they don't read any articles about that. And I think also, just to sort of dovetail, I think this moment in the 19th century that you're talking about also is, both in the United States, well, certainly in the United States, a moment of kind of consolidation, of empire and the closing of the frontier and the national narrative, and sort of creating and forging in museums. The great museums were seen in many cases as educational, that this was to sort of instill a particular notion of citizenship. This is what it is to be British. This is what it is to be American. And so I think that is kind of embedded within that. There were two questions.
But also, actually, on that point, just really quickly, is it, and this is one of the things I'm struggling with at the moment, and I think is maybe, one thing that in the UK will maybe make a contribution to in terms of whiteness. Are we talking about nativism, or are we talking about whiteness? So the point I made about the Patrick Wolf piece, that happens at home as well. And right now, for white nationalists, are they talking about nativism and indigenous white, the original indigenous white population, or are they talking about whiteness? These are two different concepts that have two different histories. And the creation of space in museums, in zoos, and other such things and indeed the role of archaeology. Pitt Rivers went on to become Inspector of Ancient Monuments and start actually for the first time making a national list of Stonehenge and Avebury and all these ancient monuments, to create empire home. So I think we need to think more about whiteness and nativism in Europe in that way.
Yeah, we can pretty clearly say in the United States that whites are not native, but
yeah, but you do have a native. Whether with Vikings or Anglo-Saxons, there is a very powerfully nativist argument as being originally from some parts of Europe, even down to whatever Trump did about the Vikings in the final weeks of his. I mean, that was absolutely bizarre moment. At which, I mean, is that about whiteness or is it about nativism anyway?
So Frances asked about how to start the negotiation process, and Deirdre, I guess, is going to articulate her question. So Deirdre, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, and then we'll let Dan kind of chew over both of these together.
Hi, it's more an observation, really. As it happens, I'm in the UK. I'm actually just down the road from you, Dan. I'm sorry, I haven't got a picture.
Okay.
I'm in Swindon in Wiltshire, so I really am just down the road from you. Yeah. I'm currently a stage 2 student with the Open University, and we've actually touched on many of these issues, including specifically a bit about the Benin Bronzes and about cultural restitution, and we looked at the case of Ishi and various things that we've looked at. I hope that I wouldn't be overstepping if I promoted your book in some of my OU groups. Give you a plug, as it were.
Sure. Okay. No, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, less of a question than a comment, I think. But yeah, lovely. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And so just back to Frances's question, which goes back to, again, the process of restitution and how do you start the negotiations?
Yeah. So I mean, we've had the Benin dialogue group for some time. A South African colleague in a meeting last week told me, well, he told the audience, but we were in dialogue on this question. He said, colonialism used to be when you told someone that they were inferior, and today colonialism is when you tell someone that they are in a dialogue. And that's definitely what we see with the Benin dialogue group, that for some of the players from the richest and most powerful institutions, this is a great, endless way to constantly kick the can down the streets, to keep talking and, of course, talking and dialogue with, local, so-called local, colleagues was a central part of, informal empire, protectorates, and so on. And therefore, that's a risk. The formation of the Legacy Restoration Trust, which is an entirely Nigerian-based entity that brings together the three main actors, the Royal Court, the federal government, and a newly elected governor of Edo State who has 4 years and is on the left and sees restitution at the top of his agenda. And, the national government, who are not on the left, but are, they're the national government and they are important stakeholders as well. That leads, I think, to an important set of possibilities. There is a dialogue, as ever. This is why the question of the process for asking for returns is important. Sometimes there can be multiple claims. There's an ongoing live conversation in Nigeria about whether all objects should go to the royal court, should all objects go to the nation state, should some go to some go to the others, depending on the different kinds of objects and so on. For me, the crucial thing is for us sort of Europeans to take ourselves out of these conversations. So the formation of the trust, because that conversation could go on for another 130 years. Who cares? It's a Nigerian conversation. Right now, all parties are agreed about the physical return and the ownership return to Nigeria. So I think we're seeing real advances. We're seeing a lot of institutions who are poised and ready to make returns when, Nigeria is ready. The diplomacy continues. And I think we simply have to do this. We have to pass the mic. We have to do our job. I'm trying to do my job of saying what's in the collections, of saying, let's move away. I mean, the biggest thing this book tries to do is to make an intervention that says this is not about activists outside the museum and who hate the museum and want to empty it, and curators inside it who care for the museum and want to keep everything. That's changing. It used to be, when I was first involved in the conversations about the Benin Dialogue Group, it used to be that the spectrum was from retentionism to restitution. And then, the British Museum changed its position to what I like to call circulationism. We'll loan you some objects back. We're open to relationships. We're open to this. And what I think those richest and most powerful institutions that have adopted the circulationist position did not realize is that suddenly the whole spectrum shifted. So no one's a no one's a retentionist anymore, right? So the circulationists are at one end of the spectrum. And then, whether in the Benin Dialogue Group or at other institutions who maybe just have a single Benin bronze, there are quite a lot of those, that doesn't really fit with their collections. And maybe they are caring, especially after recent events, about their relationship with African American audiences, their international relationship with Africa. Maybe those institutions are open. They're on a spectrum now, from circulationism through to the permanent and unconditional return, which would be my personal position. Obviously, I'm not the director of the Pitt Rivers Museum. I'm not the chair of trustees. I don't make the decisions for my institution, which is why my academic freedom here is incredibly important. I'm attempting to make an intervention as an expert in this field, as someone that has spent 14 years in this role, thinking about the collections and getting to know them, and simply frustrated by this untenable contradiction in how we think about restitution. It is a case-by-case basis, but the case-by-case basis has got to allow for cultural objects as well. So I hope that explains. It's about foregrounding, in this case, Nigerian agency, and responding to demands. This isn't about some sort of bunch of Europeans wanting to send everything back.
I want to. I no intention of kind of closing off discussion, but we are getting close to the 2-hour mark. And I think we all know that Zoom fatigue is a real thing. And especially want to acknowledge those of you who are on the other side of the pond, as we say, for whom this is, we're here nice in the afternoon sun in New York City, and the sun has just come out a little while ago, so it's quite nice. But, you may
it's a bit different.
Yeah. And you may be needing to eat your dinner or grade some papers or do other things. We want to be respectful of your time. Yes, we do have some sun in New York right now. I know, totally jealous. I can sort of show you, there's the sun in the window. But I wanted to ask, Dan, if you have some closing remarks that you want to make before, and then we can hang out and chat a little bit informally if people want to do that. I have a few announcements I'd like to make, but I want to give you a chance to sort of wrap up here. Yeah,
absolutely. So, one of the reasons I was so pleased to accept this invitation was how important, the Marxist analysis is to the book. I mean, sometimes it wears it lightly, but sometimes it's at the heart of it. And I think in Capital, Marx's account of primitive accumulation, is such an under thought through, it's a crucial, I mean, those incredible lines where he talks about the way in which the heat of the tropics somehow heats up and accelerates the process, the necessary process of dispossession, of theft, which is there to catalyze capitalism happening. There's a primary moment of stealing that has to happen for you to get into feudalism and thus, to capitalism in his view. Those acts of dispossession at the heart of corporate colonialism, we haven't started to address because the companies, this is very recent history. These companies still exist. They've got there's corporate history involved, but here in the UK, the Leverhulme Trust, one of the richest of the funding institutions, the money comes from Unilever, which is the descendant or the inheritor, corporation from the Royal Niger Company. So seeing the theft, and it's theft of, it's stolen culture, stolen climate, stolen art. In earlier phases, it was stolen people. Theft at the heart of the colonial enterprise in West Africa in these ways. So let's, I think, refresh our familiarity with, volume 1 of Capital, with the key chapters, whatever it is, 31, 29, wherever they are. Let's actually return to those incredibly lyrical lines that he, that are there. There's, I think that really actually goes to the heart of the importance of the book. I'm just trying to find just the facts of something I would love to be able to tell you if I can find it. Maybe I can share it over. I can't quite see it. There's an incredible story with the details of which I can't quite remember, about the guy that edited Capital and his relationship with the Royal Niger Company. I won't get the facts right now, but there is a sense in which, Marx in many ways is actually really thinking about West Africa and that West African moment in the writing of some, in the building of the theory of primitive accumulation. I think it's absolutely crucial that as anti-racists, we do not allow ourselves to fall into the trap of accepting the argument, the pushback, that statues, museums are a distraction from the real work of anti-racism. They are central parts and hurtful parts of the naturalization, as I've said, the ability to make a certain worldview endure. We have to fight them. We have to allow our cities, our institutions to evolve and to become fit for the 21st century. So it's not, art is important. Those of us that work in museums, like to think that, but we haven't always, actually matched up to that in terms of how we think about the politics of all this. And I guess the final thing is that, why is it that these museums have neglected art, African art, for so long? Why is it there's so much more understanding? I mean, why is it the Ashmolean doesn't have here in Oxford, the museum with all the European stuff in it? That doesn't have, less than 1% of the collections understood or on the database, or, it doesn't have, it has curators for every part of Europe. How is it we've got to this point? And the sheer final point is the sheer whiteness of our institutions. We're incredibly white. I mean, no wonder we haven't employed African curators. We haven't thought that African collections are important, because we've been looking at what we've been taught are our own culture, Western civilization, and so on. So here in Oxford, what we can do legally here in the UK is something called positive action for training. So here at Oxford, I've instigated, when I was the year in administration in the university, and I set up the positive action studentships for our masters and our graduate program, which we're rolling out now for Black and minority ethnic students, so we can start to create a pipeline where we train, where we address underrepresentation in our student body. We can't do the positive action things that you can do in the States, but we need to be campaigning for that as along hand in hand with restitution. We're not going to get anywhere if these institutions that claim to serve their wider communities don't look like their wider communities, don't really represent their wider communities. So that is a really important example of how this is anti-racism in every, in every part of in every meaning of the word. So I think on that note, it's a good point to, let's hope that when when this group reconvenes in 50 years, hopefully not over Zoom, but sort of face to face, that the curator from the UK that's sort of talking about African objects, maybe, isn't some, middle-aged white guy. Yeah, there we go. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for your really excellent questions, your observations, your commentary. There's a tremendous amount of information here. I would encourage anyone who wants to save the chat, and that way you can have all the URLs and the links, the YouTube videos, the more scholarly as well as the more humorous takes on this. I would just like to remind people that these kind of ongoing conversations are part of what we're doing at the Marxist Education Project. Tomorrow evening, unfortunately, would be the middle of the night for folks in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, but Dave Rodiger is going to be speaking. There is part of the Pluto fireworks series on Sunday afternoon from 2 to 4 Eastern Coast time, which hopefully will make it a little bit more amenable to people not in New York City. And to please check out on our website, marxedproject.org, and you can or follow us on Facebook to find out about other reading groups, classes, Capital. I was just commenting to Michael in the chat, Dan, that those two sources that you met, Fred and Mike and I were part of a reading group on extractivism, and we started with that chapter from the end of Capital on primitive accumulation, and then we read Rosa Luxemburg.
Oh, wonderful. Great.
So wonderful. If people are interested in a reading group that would address both some chapters in Dan's book and looking more broadly at the question of the exhibitionary complex, about people in museums, and really all of these problematic and important issues, to please write to us. And it is nymarxedproject@gmail.com, and I will pop that into the chat. We'd like to kind of gauge the interest of people in doing a reading group. I'd be happy to facilitate this. This is a subject that I'm really interested in. Michael has something else that he wants to add. So, Mike.
And if I can just say, actually, I just put a link into a cartoon, as I saw someone had shared the James, whatever he's Acaster sort of comedy. That's great. There's a great cartoon in the link I just put in, so you can.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I am making an announcement based on Dan bringing up primitive accumulation and capital, and Lisa throwing the Rosa mention in that there are people from the Caribbean Philosophy Association who have edited a new volume coming out called Creolizing Rosa Luxemburg. And we are going to have 6 events from scholars and activists around the world, including South Africa and Ghana, along with various parts of the Caribbean, doing a series on this beginning late March, early April. So their deadline for giving me the descriptions is long past, but I can't post it on the site yet, but it will be there. And I will definitely send an invite to Dan to join us as well, because I think that you would enjoy some of those sessions. I thank everyone for coming today. It's really wonderful to see such a good group of people, and to meet new people is always thrilling. And I can't thank you enough, Dan, for accepting the invitation and showing up and doing so much effort on that PowerPoint. That was just fantastic. And thank you so much for the work you've done. And we look forward to your further development along these lines and what other work you will do. It's really remarkable what you've done so far. And thanks again.
Super. Okay, lovely to have been here.